In honor of Women's History Month, the Lee County Library's History Club presents Famous First Ladies. First, let's start out with some trivia. Abigail Adams and Barbara Bush were both married to one president and mother to another president. Which First Lady was married to one president and grandmother to another president? The answer is Anna Harrison, who was married to William Henry Harrison, our 9th president, and was the grandmother to Benjamin Harrison, our 23rd president. First up, it's Martha Washington. Martha Washington was born Martha Dandridge on June 2, 1731, in Virginia. Unlike many women of the time, Martha Washington was literate. She liked to read her Bible, and she enjoyed writing letters to friends and family. George Washington was actually her second husband, not her first. Her first husband was Daniel Parke Custis, who died after they were married for 7 years. Most people don't realize that George Washington actually had 2 children. 2 of Martha Washington's children with Daniel Parke Custis died before they turned even 5 years old. That the other 2, Jack and Patsy, were looked after by George Washington. Martha Washington stayed at the winter encampments with her husband during the American Revolution. This included the most famous encampment of the war at Valley Forge. As First Lady, she held Friday evening receptions, starting a tradition of the First Lady as White House hostess, even though the White House hadn't even been built yet. She was known for her fashion. This included her taste in laces and shoes, and she was also known for doing needlework. George Washington, in his will, stated that he wanted his slaves freed after Martha's death. Martha actually freed them before her death, and her death occurred on May 22nd, 1802, which was 2.5 years after George Washington had died. Next up, it's Abigail Adams. Abigail Adams was born Abigail Smith on November the 11th, 1744, in Massachusetts. Her dad was a congregational minister, one of the most popular denominations in Massachusetts at the time. Abigail was also literate. Things she liked to read were the poetry of William Shakespeare and John Milton. She married her 3rd cousin, John Adams, in 1764. She wrote letters to her husband John while he was away serving in the Continental Congress. He even considered her one of his unofficial advisors. One of her famous quotes is, "Remember the ladies and be more generous." This is in reference to the way women were treated in her time. She encouraged John in her letter, in which the quote is taken from, to grant more rights to women, unlike previous generations. After the war, John Adams was appointed the ambassador first to France and then to Britain. Abigail Adams lived with him in both of these countries after the American Revolution. She was the first First Lady to live in the White House, since it was completed while John Adams was president. After John Adams' term as president, they lived in Quincy, Massachusetts, which is the town she lived in until her death in 1818. After her death, her son John Quincy Adams became the sixth president in 1824. Next up is Dolley Madison. Dolley Madison was born Dolly Payne in 1768. The religious denomination that her family belonged to is known as the Quakers. She has a North Carolina connection. Her birthplace was Guilford County, which is where Greensboro is located. Her family moved to Virginia when she was a baby, and to Philadelphia, a city known for its Quaker connection, as it was founded by Quakers, when she was a teen. She married John Todd Jr. in 1790, and they had a son together. Unfortunately, Todd died of yellow fever just 3 years later. But she found love again, this time with James Madison. They got married in September of 1794. Since James Madison was an Episcopalian and not a Quaker, she had to give up being a Quaker. That was okay with her because the Quakers were known for dressing very plainly, but Dolley Madison loved to dress fashionably. She also threw parties. These parties served a political purpose as well. They became known as parlor diplomacy. During the War of 1812, when James Madison was president, we were at war with the British again. This time, the British stormed Washington, capturing the city and burning it. Even the White House burned, but thanks to Dolley Madison's quick thinking, she was able to save a portrait of George Washington. The legend says that she tucked it under her petticoats. Probably she just threw it in the back of a wagon, though, or had a servant do it for her. James Madison died in 1836, and she died later on in 1849. Next up is Mary Todd Lincoln. Mary Todd Lincoln was born December 13th, 1818 in Lexington, Kentucky. She was from a very wealthy family, she was well educated, and she even learned how to speak French, which she was very proud of. Unfortunately, her mom died when she was young, and she didn't get along with her stepmom. In 1839, she moved in with her older sister in Springfield, Illinois. One of her suitors, which is one of the guys she dated, was Stephen Douglas. Stephen Douglas would go on to become Abraham Lincoln's rival in politics. Douglas and Lincoln would run against each other for the Senate in 1858, and Douglas would win. But 2 years later, in 1860, they would run against each other for president, and Lincoln would win. The way she met Abraham Lincoln was that he was her cousin's law partner. They courted or dated, but they broke up. A little while later, they made up, and they got married soon afterwards. As First Lady, she was criticized for her spending. She loved fashion, just like Dolley Madison, and loved to wear elegant dresses. You can see some of her elegant dresses in the top pictures. She was not only criticized for her spending, which people called too extravagant, but she was criticized because her brothers fought for the Confederacy, and people even accused her of being a spy. She lost 2 sons when they were very young. After Willie died while Abraham Lincoln was president. She became very upset after her son Willie's death. She even began acting erratically. That means not always rationally. She even conducted seances to try to communicate with her dead son. After Abraham Lincoln was president, she lost another son named Tad. Her remaining son, Robert, had her institutionalized. Later on, she was released from the institution, but she died in 1882. Next up is Frances Cleveland. Frances Cleveland is America's youngest First Lady. She was only 21. She was born July 21st, 1864 in Buffalo, New York. Her parents were Oscar and Frances Folsom. Oscar Folsom's law partner was Grover Cleveland. Grover Cleveland bought Frances's first baby carriage. Unfortunately, Oscar died when Frances was very young. Later, Frances went to Wells College, which was an all-women's college in New York. While she was there, Grover and Frances Cleveland began exchanging letters with each other, and their friendship blossomed into romance. She went with her mom to visit the White House because by this time Grover was president. There was a rumor in Washington that Grover would marry Emma, who was his deceased friend and law partner Oscar's widow. But the truth was Grover and Frances had fallen in love and were planning to get married. This came as a shock to everyone because there was such a big age difference between the two. Grover was 48 years old, but Frances was only 21 years old. She was the First Lady to get married in the White House itself. She became a very popular First Lady in spite of the initial shock because she was known for being very charming and very stylish. You can see the stylish dresses she wore in our pictures. Grover died after leaving the White House in 1908. Frances Cleveland remarried, but she chose to be buried beside her first husband, Grover. Next up is Edith Wilson. Edith was born Edith Bowling in 1872 in Western Virginia. She dropped out of Mary Washington College, and she married Norman Galt. They had a son together, but unfortunately both of them died. Edith Wilson was the first lady in the city of Washington to drive her own car. She had a friend who was dating Woodrow Wilson's doctor. Woodrow had recently lost his wife, Ellen. So both Woodrow and Edith had recently lost spouses. She and Woodrow were married, making him the third president to marry while in office. Woodrow was re-elected in the midst of World War I going on in Europe. In spite of his promise during his election campaign to keep the U.S. out of World War I, eventually the U.S. had no choice but to enter it anyway. She became an unofficial advisor to her husband and attended regular cabinet meetings. At the end of World War I, Woodrow Wilson was present for the signing of the Treaty of Versailles, which ended the war. As part of the Treaty of Versailles, he wanted to form a League of Nations. This would serve to prevent future wars by allowing nations to get together and talk about their differences. Today we have the United Nations, which was based on the League of Nations. But Woodrow Wilson had trouble gaining support for the League of Nations in the U.S. He embarked on a tour across the country to gain support. Unfortunately for Woodrow, he had a stroke while he was doing that. Edith essentially took over the role as president, controlling who saw the president, reading documents, and encouraging her husband to sign or not to sign. Edith is sometimes called the first woman president, even though she never acted officially in this role. Woodrow Wilson would die in 1924. She died many years later in 1961. Time for another trivia question. Grover Cleveland married Frances while in office, and Woodrow Wilson married Edith while in office. Who is the only other president who got married while in office? The answer is John Tyler, who married his second wife, Julia. Next up is Eleanor Roosevelt. Eleanor was born on October the 11th, 1884 in New York City. She was the niece of our 26th president, Theodore Roosevelt, who was also known as Teddy Roosevelt. Both of her parents died when she was very young, before she was even 10 years old. She attended Allenswood boarding school in London, and she married her distant cousin, Franklin D. Roosevelt. Her Uncle Teddy gave her away at the wedding. Together, her and her husband, Franklin D. Roosevelt, had 6 children. She helped her husband, Franklin, when he got polio. Polio was a disease that was very common back then, especially among children. However, Franklin didn't get it until he was well into adulthood. She became very interested in doing volunteer work as well as working in politics. She was politically active as First Lady, giving press conferences, conducting tours, and giving speeches. She even wrote her own daily newspaper column called My Day. She advocated for women's rights, for civil rights, and for human rights. The picture at the bottom of the page shows her with Marian Anderson. Marian Anderson was a gifted African-American singer at the time. The Daughters of the American Revolution canceled a concert of hers because they did not want an African-American performer. However, Eleanor invited Marian Anderson to give a concert in front of the Lincoln Memorial, which was a huge success. Later on, after Franklin had died and Eleanor was done being First Lady, Eleanor served as a delegate to the United Nations. Her chief achievement as the United Nations delegate was to help draft the Declaration of Human Rights. She later served on the Commission on the Status of Women, and she died in 1962. Next up is Jacqueline Kennedy. Jacqueline Kennedy was born Jacqueline Bouvier on July 28, 1929, in New York. She attended boarding school as well as Vassar and the Sorbonne in France. She graduated from George Washington University and became a reporter and photographer. She met John F. Kennedy while he was a congressman, and he proposed later on after he became a senator. She experienced 2 stillbirths. That means 2 of her children were born already dead. She also had 2 other children, Caroline and John F. Kennedy Jr. As First Lady, she invited artists and intellectuals to the White House. She was also interested in the historical preservation of the White House, forming a White House Historical Association, to promote the restoration and education. She even appointed a curator of the White House. She was very popular because of her charm and style. She was especially popular in France. This was because of her love of French culture. She spoke French fluently and loved French fashion. Part of this was because of her time living in France when she attended the Sorbonne. After her husband, John F. Kennedy, was assassinated, she thought it was important to attend the Lyndon Baines Johnson inauguration, which she did. She also planned her husband's funeral. Years later, she married the Greek tycoon Aristotle Onassis. That was in 1968. After moving back to New York City, she worked as an editor. She died in 1994 there in New York. Now we have Betty Ford. Betty Ford was born Elizabeth Loomer on April the 18th, 1918 in Chicago, Illinois. She moved to Grand Rapids, Michigan. Her dad died when she was young, and her mom worked to help support the family. She learned how to dance when she was only 8 years old, and she taught dance as a teenager. She went to Bennington College in Vermont, where she met the famous dancer and dance instructor Martha Graham. She performed with Martha when she worked as a dancer. She also worked as a model. After moving back to Grand Rapids, she became a fashion consultant. She married a man named William Warren, and they remained married for 5 years, but that marriage ended in divorce. She married Gerald Ford in 1948 while he was campaigning for the House of Representatives. Gerald won that election and served as a representative from Michigan. In 1973, Spiro Agnew resigned as vice president. Richard Nixon appointed Gerald Ford to be vice president. After Gerald Ford was appointed vice president, Richard Nixon had to resign because of the Watergate scandal, in which Nixon influenced people to break into the Watergate Hotel in order to spy on Democratic headquarters. After Nixon's resignation in 1974, Gerald Ford became the president. Betty Ford became very popular for her openness. One of the things she was open about was the fact that she had cancer. As a cancer survivor, she encouraged other women and inspired them to get checked. Another thing she was supportive of was the Equal Rights Amendment, which she was very vocal about. Part of the reason why she was so supportive of the Equal Rights Amendment was because she had saw how hard her mom worked, and also because of how hard she had worked. She believed that women deserved the same pay as men. In 1975, Time magazine voted Betty Ford Woman of the Year. In 1976, when Gerald Ford ran for re-election, one of the campaign slogans was, "Vote for Betty's husband." This reflected how very popular Betty was. Gerald Ford lost his re-election bid, and later on, Betty Ford became addicted to alcohol and to pills. She was rehabilitated and founded the Betty Ford Center to help others suffering from the same problem get treatment. Nancy Reagan is next. Nancy Reagan was born July 6, 1921 in New York City. She attended the Chicago Latin School for Girls. She majored in drama at Smith College in Massachusetts. She became an actress just like how her mom was an actress. She met the recently divorced movie star Ronald Reagan when she went to Hollywood and began to act in movies. They married on March the 4th, 1952 in Los Angeles. The picture at the top shows a picture of their wedding. William Holden, another famous movie star, was the best man. Together, Ronald and Nancy starred in the movie Hellcats of the Navy. As First Lady, she raised funds to refurbish the White House, relying on private donations. Like many other First Ladies, Nancy loved to dress stylishly. She loved to wear the color red, becoming known as the Woman in Red or the Lady in Red. She also bought new china for the White House and invited many celebrities who she had befriended during her time in Hollywood. Unfortunately, this drew much criticism because some felt that she spent too lavishly. Another thing that drew criticism was her love of astrology. Consulting an astrologer, which many believed was superstitious. However, she was known for her platform that was Just Say No. This was a platform to discourage young people from using and abusing drugs. The Just Say No to Drugs campaign was a very popular and well-known campaign at the time. After her time as First Lady, she helped her husband Ronald when he suffered from Alzheimer's disease, which is a disease that debilitates a person's memory. She died on March the 6th, 2016 in Los Angeles, California. Next up is Barbara Bush. Barbara Bush was the wife of President number 41, George Herbert Walker Bush, and the mother of President number 43, George Walker Bush. Barbara Bush was born Barbara Pierce on June the 8th, 1925 in New York City. She was the descendant of another president, our 14th president, Franklin Pierce. Barbara Bush had a lifelong love of reading, and later on in life, she started a literacy foundation to encourage others to read. She dropped out of Smith College and got married to George Herbert Walker Bush. After George was done serving in World War II, the family had their first son, who was George Walker Bush, who would grow up to be President number 43. The family moved to Connecticut around that time, where George Herbert Walker Bush attended college. Later on, the family would move to Texas and California as Barbara's husband would work in the oil industry. Other children that they had included their daughter Robin, who died as a little girl of leukemia. This was a devastating loss for the Bush family, and Barbara's hair was said to have turned white because of the stress that she was dealing with during that time. Another son, Jeb, became governor of Florida, and their son Neil, who was dyslexic, helped to encourage Barbara to start her literacy foundation. She wanted to encourage dyslexic people that they could read too. She went to New York City and China as her husband served as both the ambassador first to the United Nations and later on to China. She was known for wearing pearls, and as First Lady, she wrote a book called Millie's Book, which was a book about the White House from the Bush family dog's perspective. She died April the 17th, 2018 in Houston, Texas, where the Bush family had come to live. Next up, it's Hillary Clinton. Hillary Clinton was born Hillary Rodham on October the 26th, 1947 in Chicago, Illinois. She went to Wellesley College for her undergraduate, then to Yale Law School. She met Bill Clinton at Yale Law School. When Bill Clinton was elected governor of Arkansas in 1978, she became the First Lady of Arkansas. 2 years later, their daughter Chelsea was born. You can see Chelsea on her wedding day in the bottom photo. Hillary Clinton served as a director at Walmart from 1986 to 1992. She was the First Lady of the United States from 1993 to 2001. And she became the First Lady to be elected to a public office. She served as a senator from New York from 2001 to 2009. She also ran for the Democratic presidential nomination in 2008 against Barack Obama. She lost this race to Barack Obama, but he appointed her his Secretary of State, and she served in that role from 2009 to 2013. She won the Democratic nomination for president in 2016, but lost the general election to President Donald Trump. Next up is Michelle Obama. Michelle Obama was our first African-American First Lady. She was born Michelle Robinson on January 17, 1964 in Chicago, Illinois. Her dad, Frazier, suffered from and died of multiple sclerosis. Her brother, Craig, has worked as a basketball coach, including being the head coach for Oregon State University. Michelle Obama went to Princeton for her undergraduate and graduated from Harvard Law School. She moved back to Chicago where she became a lawyer, which is where she met and married Barack Obama. Barack and Michelle have 2 daughters, Malia and Natasha, although Natasha is known by her nickname, Sasha. As First Lady, her platform was to promote healthy habits. She planted a vegetable garden in the White House lawn to encourage better eating habits. She also started the Let's Move campaign. This was to encourage exercise and to discourage obesity in children. Right to bear arms? She went sleeveless in some of her White House portraits. This was unusual for a First Lady and drew much criticism. She also set style trends, including a dress that she wore from Target selling out. After she was done being First Lady, she wrote an autobiography which is entitled Becoming. Time for one last bit of trivia before we go. Our current First Lady, Melania Trump, is one of only 2 First Ladies born outside the United States. Do you know who the other one is? It was Louisa Adams, the wife of John Quincy Adams, who was born in Britain.